Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the brand new album from Eric Taxxon called The Anthill. So I've talked a little in the past about accessibility to music and how in today's day and age anybody with an internet connection can find their ways to get the music out there, record labels be damned. But over the past couple of years as a music critic, I've observed both sides to this issue, especially for indie acts. Sure, you might not need a label for promotion, but it occasionally helps, or to ensure that your music is vaguely listenable, but that also means that the floodgates have been torn open, and for every act of high quality, we get a whole lot more copycats, recycled material, and weirdness that for everyone's sake should have probably gotten lost in the avalanche. Is not particularly all that listenable. And I definitely think this is worth restating. Just because an artist might have a weird idea that seems kind of different or unique doesn't mean that they get a free pass. Points for creativity, to be sure, but execution also does matter. And yet, given now that I've opened up my own schedule doors thanks to Patreon, we've got one of those more experimental acts that have climbed up the schedule. Eric Taxxon, an electronic producer from Santa Cruz, California. His claim on his Bandcamp is that none of his projects will ever sound the same. And having gone through all dozen or so of them, he's definitely correct in that regard, because his material tears through every reach and subgenre of electronica like it's going out of style. From plunderphonics to drone to MIDI-driven electropop and noise, this guy has gone into a lot of territory with his disjointed grasp on melody, his fascinating collage of samples, and his occasionally interesting conceptual frameworks. And oh, did I mention that the majority of his projects were dropped over the past year? We're past Drake or Ty Segall levels, folks. The sheer amount of material that Taxon has released is a little bit astounding, but it's also indicative that some of his pieces could have afforded a bit more care and refinement. Taxon puts his toes into these waters of these genres, but perhaps a little bit more refinement might help them stick the landing a little bit better, or feel like more cohesive and developed and memorable songs. Because here's the thing, he's made some stuff that I have liked. The more developed synthpop of Find My Nom is pretty solid, and some of his plunderphonics experiments have been pretty fascinating, especially his album last year, Copy, but I'd be curious to see what would happen if Taxon decided to dedicate more focus to a singular project and really refine it or perfect it. Now, that being said, his newest project, The Anthill, did seem like something I could get behind. Pivoting back towards synthpop and electropop, it could very well be kind of interesting. So, what did we get with The Anthill? Well, if anything, we probably got one of his most accessible and borderline conventional projects to date, and yet it's arguably one of Eric Taxxon's better albums, mostly because it refines a lot of his melodic tendencies and instincts into a pretty tightly written MIDI-inspired synth-pop package. He described it as a collection of pop tunes for dogs and other gentle creatures to jam out to, and if these dogs were the sort of sweetly innocent and quirky animals that you see in cartoons that could get into bouncy, MIDI-driven synth-pop, I would entirely agree with that assessment. And when you analyze it on that smaller scale and framing, I'd argue there's something kind of special about The Anthill, filling its own little tiny niche in the genre admirably, and yet still with enough originality to feel distinct. So first, a little bit of context, because The Anthill isn't precisely a big or immediately impressive project in its sound, as of course it's not trying to be. Just over a half hour, it's primarily composed on keyboards that span piano to more sequenced, chirpy synth loops, with hints of the scratchier, rougher percussion that Taxon is better known for, and that gives it a hint of more organic, rough presence. But even with all that, much of the darker, more immediately abrasive whiplash transitions and samples, they're not here. If anything, the project is positively precious in its usage of bright, upbeat melodies on the keys. Almost cute in a strange way. I was initially inclined to make comparisons between this and, say, like the Postal Service, and make no mistake, you can definitely draw that parallel in the instrumentation. But while there is some underlying melancholy with the more muted tones interwoven, the emotions are framed as smaller and more intimate, just not through the placement of the keys and the beats very close to the front of the mix, but also how there are only touches of that greater size and depth, like around the vocals of Small Hopes, or the absolutely beautiful ethereal swells around Small Rivers, probably my favorite song here. And that framing means that the piano interlude, Small Pianos, feels more semi-improvised than actually amateurish in its halting but kind of interesting progression, or how the blubbery MIDI-inspired tones that are borderline chiptune manage to put you in the mind of old retro video games, or how the actual rap verses on Small Minds Think Alike might feel kind of old school, but connect surprisingly well for me. They're actually pretty well structured. For as much as the Flaming Lips are trying to stare towards youth and oxymolody, Eric Taxxon is much more nimbly gets to the core of that childlike innocence that comes in being a slightly depressed preteen who doesn't quite feel like he's got much control of his life, but ultimately still has some hope and creativity going forward. It hasn't been squashed out of him just yet. And a big part of all this is the delivery. And one of the reasons I'd argue that the Postal Service comparison is kind of apt, because Taxon actually contributes vocals to this project himself, something that he's rarely, if ever, done. Now, he's not exactly a great singer. There are songs where you can hear him slipping a little bit flat on some of the high notes, which, no, was not an excuse for the chipmunk vocals on Small Dreams, probably the most dance-ready track and also my least favorite. But between the lo-fi filter on his vocals and the hushed delivery, he doesn't really need to be a great singer to get his message across. Again, the keywords here are small and intimate, with only the real shift against it being some of the beats that would probably hit with a little bit more impact than you would expect, being a little bit heavier, a little bit blockier. But when you focus on that little small soundscape, you can assert a lot of control over your atmosphere, and Taxon keeps it melodic and pretty interesting. From the theremin tones on Small Dangers to emphasize the eeriness to the chirpy brightness of Small Virtues, to how he doesn't shy away from progressions that could feel borderline twee if it weren't balanced against some lower, often muted or rounded or melancholic tones that actually add a fair bit of balance to these songs. Now granted, there are some problems with this album, and they mostly come in the lyrics and the writing, most because these songs can feel a bit underwritten. Take Small Adventures. It's one story repeated, but told over and over again with only small variants in the instrumentation. And while the detail is good in the writing, it does drag pretty quickly. I'm not a huge fan of it. Or take Small Minds. He's a good enough MC that I would have preferred just adding a third verse instead of just overlaying the first verse and the second verse on top of each other to end the track, trying to draw some syncopation there. But at the end of the day, those are some pretty minor concerns, and otherwise pretty interesting little project. It does not blow my mind in the production or the writing, but I've always had a slight aversion to the more twee side of music. I can admit that about myself, and it's a testament to Taxon's command of his atmosphere and a lot of his writing that this does not get insufferable very fast for me. I'll give him credit for that. In fact, for me, this is a light 7 out of 10. I did enjoy this. It's quite good. And it's definitely a recommendation if you can get behind some introverted but melodically well-balanced synthpop, and especially if you're a fan of the Postal Service, because not like we're getting a Postal Service album anytime soon. In comparison with his other projects, The Anthill is easily one of Eric Taxxon's most accessible, but also arguably one of his most tight and cohesive as well. And even though I doubt he'll return to this sound anytime soon, this was a pretty good experiment. Definitely check it out. It's worth it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. Like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I can't imagine many people have heard this project, but I got the poll up here, so if you had, I'd be curious to see what you guys thought of it, especially in comparison with his other work. I get a link to buy the album down in the description below in case you guys are too lazy to Google. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. My Patreon operates if you guys want to get more involved in my scheduling. 3 times a week you get to vote, and once a week for the higher Patreon contributors, you guys get to add albums to that schedule. But beyond that, the other big news is that I finally hit 25,000 subscribers. I'll be doing something special for that event. I had original big plans for it, but they kind of fell through. I'm a little disappointed with that, but whatever, moving on. So that'll probably be coming out tomorrow or Sunday. We'll see what happens. But till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.